All right, so this is a BrownBag session on generic security reports. This is kind of a longer ongoing discussion that I started, I don't know how long ago. It feels like a long time ago, about having a generic report type and everything that would entail and what that would mean to us, some of the benefits and impacts it would have on our team and integrators. So let's move on with our presentation. So who am I? My name is James Johnson. I'm a staff security engineer on the vulnerability research team. And I should kind of point out that I am a bit, maybe not biased, but the direction I'm coming from on this is from the vulnerability research team, our core purpose, if you wanted to put it at a high level, is to iterate quickly on either improving or creating new analyzers. So having a fast loop to do that directly impacts me and everyone else on my team. It impacts everybody, but that's kind of the direction that I've been viewing this from. And these are links to prior discussions that we've had on this. This is the main one, restructuring the security reports. This is also very closely related and was spun off of restructuring the security report. It's specifically about tracking the tracking vulnerabilities in an evolving project. So if you have a generic security report, you need to also be able to track vulnerabilities throughout a project generically and not specific to an analyzer type. So that's why that one got spun off. And these are two previous related merge requests. These aren't the proof of concept merge requests that I'm talking about today or using, but these definitely influenced things that I'm going to show right now. All right, so this to me is the big question about this proposal is what would the impact be of a zero cost integration for new scanners? If we could say a scanner is already developed, we just need to integrate it, what impact would it have on us, our customers, everyone, if that was a non-issue? So before we really get into the technical details, going to kind of tell a story about what that impact would mean. So let's imagine that we have time-traveling saboteurs who have targeted GitLab. And this is in the future. Future GitLab managed to catch them in time before any damage was caused. But how did they do this? So it all started one day when a developer was reading the Git commit history, as that person liked to do, just randomly reading the Git log. And they noticed something very interesting. There was a commit that was not sequential with the other commits. It happened in the future. And so this caused that user, that developer, to be concerned. And that developer notified the security team. I mean, that's what I would do if I saw potential time traveling occurring in my Git repository. I don't remember what was supposed to be on that page. So, oh, that's right. I added animations. All right, so the security team looked into it, and this is what they discovered. Multiple repositories were affected. Something in common with all of the repositories, they all shared a common CI configuration. And so they were thinking maybe they could add a custom analyzer to help detect these anomalies in the Git repositories and stop whatever shenanigans are going on with the time travelers. So the developer, though, thought about how much effort it took to integrate new analyzers in the past, how front-end, back-end, database, and schema changes all had to be made before they could start using a new analyzer. And specifically about this, it's not just a new analyzer that conforms to existing report types. This is specifically about adding an entirely new report type that doesn't conform to what GitLab already supports. And here are, let's see, I don't know if you guys can see the little window that I'm moving around that has everyone's faces. So these are some statistics that I pulled together. So the number of files, those are spread out across the merge requests. They're not unique files. I just looked at all of the merge requests I could find that were related to each of these efforts. and then added up all the numbers, right? So adding SAS for kubesec, it was spread across at least 5 merge requests, involved 1,500 additions, 3 deletions, and impacted 30 file changes. And coverage guided fuzzing across 4 merge requests, 1,300 changes, 71 deletions, and that occurred across 77 different file changes. Again, not unique. There's probably a lot of changes in the merge requests that occurred on the same files. So this developer was thinking about how much effort it took, and also that there was not a relevant report type for detecting time travelers. They had SAST, DAST, coverage guided fuzzing, secret detection, nothing for time travelers. So let me move this. So luckily, this occurred in the future. Future GitLab had this problem, and they, in that version of the universe, they did have generic security reports. And so they had Freeform typed vulnerability details, and adding a new analyzer that didn't conform to any of the existing, I don't know if there's a word for it, schema-ified analyzer reports. Those changes would require no front-end, back-end database or schema changes. So the security team, they decided, since we have a common CI configuration for all of these repositories that are impacted, they're going to write a new job that directly implements an analyzer in the job itself and spits out a GitLab security report type. Oh, and I did actually implement this, and we can walk through it later. So, and this is what they wrote. This is the part of the script of the job. They have a utility CLI tool that they can use from the command line to initialize and add vulnerabilities to a report JSON. And so they mix that with a bunch of Git commands to find any Git commits that occurred in the future, that occurred before today's date. And so having this in the merge request pipeline means that you can block a merge request if you think it came from a time traveler. And here's the job. And this is how it shows up when you look at the vulnerability details. So they've identified a potential time traveler. His name is Time McTravely, and he's using gmail2.0.com, and he likes Ruby 4.9 for some reason, which doesn't exist. Maybe I didn't go high enough on the version number. But so this is a output from a quick analyzer that the security team put together in order to detect these time travelers. And so in less than an hour, they had the custom analyzer, the custom security report, custom information in the vulnerability details, and they saved GitLab from whatever the time traveler saboteurs are trying to do. Now, people heard of this success, other teams within GitLab, and so they wanted access to the security report that was produced by the time traveler analyzer. So the data science team talked to the security team and told them that they wanted to know what format they could expect from that analyzer. So the security team, they wrote a schema that conforms to the generic schema, but then also captured the current format of the time traveler analyzer output. And they gave that to the security or the data science team. And it looks something like this. So it inherits everything. It conforms to the generic report format. And then it defines specific fields and their types that are still using the freeform data types, but are specific to the time traveler output. And so if anyone wanted to know what to expect from that output, they could use this schema and work off of that. All right, so story time's over. I felt like a story would kind of help paint the picture of the potential impact this would have. And really, once I had all of the tools in place, so I was acting as this security team, right? Writing this, once I had all of the proof of concept code, plus this report tool that created the report on the command line, I really did create this in maybe half an hour or so. Yeah. So let's move on. These are the 2 merge requests specific to this proof of concept. There's one merge request specifically for GitLab org GitLab, and then another one that adds a generic security report schema into our security report schemas repository. And they are both, I would say, a little rough. They're both marked as draft, not ready to merge, haven't added tests for everything. Definitely need to polish the edges, but it demonstrates the point that the points that I'm trying to demonstrate or make. So any questions before I go on and talk a little more technically about this? Oh, and that time traveler report on the vulnerability dashboard or security dashboard, it's all up and running. So if you want me to pull it up, we can look at it and tweak things and see what happens. All right. Otherwise, oh, I am not watching the Google Doc. I just need to put that on my other monitor. That is not it. BrownBag. Okay. That's easy enough. No questions. And cool. All right, so a little more details about the freeform typed details field. This is, I don't know if I included it actually. So in the current schema for vulnerabilities or vulnerability reports, let me pull this up. This is
Before you go through the schema, do you have an example of what the time traveler JSON would look like?
Yeah, sure do. Oh, that's the schema. I think I saved it to here earlier today. Yep, here we go. This is it. And actually, I can pull up the GitLab development. I'm going to pull up the CI job that created this too. And I'll put those side by side. Size. Window-A. All right. Test project, GitLab CI.yaml. Okay, can you see that? Is it big enough? Or do you want to only look at one at a time? Move that. All right, so here on the right, this is the report itself. And here on the left is what created the report. And this did actually run. This tool was a kind of, I was planning on doing something like this anyways, but I kind of needed it for the demo to demonstrate the impact of zero cost analyzer integrations. But this tool does exist. And so this creates the report. Actually, no, this doesn't create it. There's common information in every vulnerability, and this kind of sets some metadata and saves it into a temporary file. And all of this is just working with the Git commits itself. At this point, we've detected that a commit is from a date that's past the current date. And then we grab the author out of it, and this is where we start putting the report together. And oh, there's some things about the GitLab codebase that I'm not entirely sure about. So like the categories, there are categories and ultimate features in the proof of concept for the GitLab codebase. I didn't add a security type for those. I wasn't sure if I needed to. So if you see me still using SAS, I'm kind of piggybacking off of those code changes or what currently exists because I hadn't gotten to that yet. But here we're adding a report, a vulnerability to the report. This is the name of it, and that's the message, and here's the description of it. But yeah, this is all set from the command line, and this is actually used as the tracking field inside of the vulnerability. So how we're currently using the location field for each vulnerability to tell if a vulnerability is unique, the generic report type adds the tracking field so that we can do that generically and not specific to a report type. And this is extra data that goes into the details field. And so is this one. And this is adding a made-up identifier to the identifiers field of the vulnerability. And this is, again, extra details about it. Did you want to look at more at the JSON, Seth?
Yeah, I was just curious as to what in here is generic versus what is
Okay.
kind of strongly typed. And what it looks like is those lines are essentially what we've got today.
Yep.
Line 14 is a variation of what we have today.
Yeah.
And really,
let me turn off my relative line numbers. It's, there we go. Oh, no, that didn't set. No relative number. There we go. Now the line numbers won't change on us.
So I think the key thing that we're looking at here is line, here we go.
It came back. What? Set no relative line number. There we go.
You turn it off on the other buffer.
Yeah, I've got some Vim functions where if I lose focus from one buffer, it changes it to not be relative anymore. But then when I go back into it, it turns it back on. So we're good now.
But yeah, basically what we're introducing here is line 23 on down.
The details field, yeah.
Yep.
And the tracking field.
And tracking, yep.
Yeah. And the other type here is source. And then you have to say the file name and then line start and end, right? And so these have separate implementations in the GitLab code base. So that we can start handling them separately. So the hash method does basically just hashes this, and that's the way we're doing the location field roughly right now. If you use the source type, since it has a different implementation on the GitLab code or in the GitLab code, we can start using like git diff tracking or some sort of scope aware tracking for this that doesn't rely on just this information right here. Yeah, and so getting back to what you were saying, Seth, yes, these are exactly what, or this is the big change, is putting details about the vulnerability into here instead of having them up here. And yeah, each of these are, they all have a type field, and that says what type that, well, obviously, that field is. And the UI has a one-to-one mapping for every type. It knows how to render it, and they can be nested. Yeah, and Cameron, you had mentioned what about internationalization? So that got me thinking while I was implementing the proof of concept, I added this too. So you can, if say a third-party integrator wanted to provide their own translations of things, they could do it in there as well.
By the way, we don't have internationalization on our current solution, so I don't expect you to solve that.
Well, it's roughly in place. Yeah, it's using the same. So on the view side, we're using GED and get text to translate things. This constructs that data dynamically from these different language, or from the language array, right? Yeah, and it uses by default the language of the person viewing it. But yeah, so this report directly so I've actually got two separate, here, I'll just pull this up. This will be easier. Where is, go back to here, and this is, come on, click. All right. So this is my local GitLab instance, right? And it is a little slow, so hopefully it won't take forever right now. All right, so time traveler should be in here. Commit from a time traveler. There we go. And that's exactly what shows up, is that data from the report is exactly this. And so this is a commit specific field. So even though they are typed, they don't have to be just basic types. They don't have to be just a text or you know, a list. We could have complex types that are reusable, and then as we improve on them, it will improve everything that uses them. So this commit one, I did want to make this a little more than just a link. So you can copy the commit SHA, and I was trying to get the icon to work where we have a git commit looking icon next to it, but I couldn't get that. But this is a code block that shows the raw commit data, and this is just a text field.
And what you have in this prototype is, I think it was like 7 or 8 different types of fields.
Yes, yeah, and so I've got those listed out.
Yep, there they are.
And yeah, here we go. Yeah, so there's a named list, and then just a list, a table, text, URL, code, integer, and a commit, file location, and module location. And so I figured this was a pretty decent set of things that we could start with, or at least for proof of concept that I wanted to show. And I was trying to get a Markdown field to work. We were talking about that in the issue description. I ended up deciding to focus on finishing the slides. So, but yeah, those are all implemented. And let's see.
Yeah, that was my next question. There's really no reason you couldn't have a Markdown field, right?
Oh, no, it's not. It's just how exactly you want to go about doing it.
Yep.
I found one place in our code base where I don't know what a notebook is in GitLab. There's some UI front-end code specifically about notebooks that uses a native JavaScript Markdown renderer, but I couldn't find anything that used it, so I didn't go that route. When you preview text, like in a comment, it actually sends the data back to the Rails side through an API, and then it returns the Markdown rendered as HTML. So yeah, there are definitely ways to do it. Yeah. And so another field here that I think would be really cool. So I guess 2 of them for what we currently have are especially interesting to me would be a HTTP request where we could work on that component and improve it, where it could show like a curl request that you can copy and paste that would do the exact same thing as the request itself. We could make it show up or as a downloadable like Wireshark packet if you wanted to view it in that, or like a Postman file. And the module location, if the module location, I actually meant to change this. Module location is about a location inside of a pre-built binary. And this is something that comes up in fuzzing. So right now, all it puts together the module name and the offset, and that's all it does. But you could improve it to show, actually grab that build artifact and show the object dump at that location and show the raw disassembly that it's pointing to. Yeah, so that's where I could see that going. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways this could go. And for the time traveler one, we could have a time traveler specific component that is more involved, yeah.
But all these fields still rely on a single value, right? So, or can you put multiple values or more complicated?
You can put multiple values. So the named list and list, I've got an example of that. I don't remember if I deleted it in this pipeline.
So inside that value field, you can add any nesting or object.
Exactly.
Okay.
Let me just go to an older one and then time. Okay, I didn't delete it here. Oh, oops. Don't need to look at the job itself. So when I was testing this, I just had a static GL security report.json that I was manually editing while I worked on the UI. But yeah, this is using a table, a commit, a list of URLs, a raw text block, a code block, and this is a name list nested inside of the main one, right? So you can nest these lists as much as you want, and that's what's happening right here. So here's a list inside of the main list. Inside of that list, there is just a list of integers. And one of them has a normal format, one of them has a hex format. And both of these are just text fields. And every field inside of a named list has a description option as well, or it requires a name and then has an optional description field. And this is what shows up if you hover over the question mark. And this is a link to a file location. This one, I personally would love to make this work so that it would actually show the file contents here. it's kind of a pain to go through security reports quickly if you have to click on the file and then jump to it. But yes, can definitely be nested. All right. I'm going to move on. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me. Here we are. Yeah, we have about half an hour left, or 20 minutes. All right, so I mentioned internationalization. This is a little rough. The language field, it doesn't enforce the language value, so you could really put whatever you want right there, but it does work. And these are the view components themselves. Again, like I said, a one-to-one mapping pretty much of all of them. There is an extra view component if you happen to dig into it. The label is not exposed to the user. And yeah, this is that nested example that I showed you. And the tracking field, I did mention this. There was a need for it for this proof of concept. I was trying to not mix the two discussions about tracking vulnerabilities and having a generic report, but I kind of needed to. Since the generic report needs to be generic, you need a generic way to track or declare how to track a vulnerability. And currently, the way we track it is report specific. So we did need a generic way to do that. Oh, cool. You're getting... Oh, okay. I'll get to your question, Tiago. All right. And adding the field right now, even though we're just doing the same thing on the back end as we are currently doing, means that it sets things up to be able to track vulnerabilities generically in the way that we talked about in this discussion. And this discussion specifically talks about using git diff tracking or an abstract syntax tree aware method of tracking a location in a file. All right, and Tiago has a question about, okay. Can a third party define their own type? Yes, rendering new types would require UI work, but they can mix and match with whatever we currently have as much as they want. So this is all created based off of the core data types. And so as new types become available and improve, the third-party integrators would definitely be able to use any of that. Does that answer your question, Tiago?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Awesome. And Matt says, how close is this to being something we could work towards moving to or start moving to? What are the steps needed? What might break? What are the risks and the unknowns? So the way I implemented this right now, it doesn't touch the way things are currently done with SAS, DAST, and everything else. In the discussion issue, I had tried to lay out a smaller MVC where we add a details field, and then later we add a fully generic security report type. It didn't really make sense once I got into implementing it to do it that way. So I went ahead and implemented a generic security report type that is totally separate from all of our other report types. And so how far away is it from being used? I would definitely want somebody to look at this instead of just me. I'm definitely not as experienced with a lot of that code as you guys are, but it does work, and it didn't break SAS and DAST and the other ones as far as I can tell.
But I guess the way it's designed, this could run right alongside everything that's in place today. And that's what you have actually on your local copy.
Yep, exactly. And so related to that, there is a reason why I added, so Cameron, you had some questions about the schema itself. If we wanted to transition some of the existing report types to this, we wouldn't have to, but if we wanted to, we could do it this way, right? Where we inherit from the generic report type, and then we define the specific fields that that specific analyzer spits out. And then output from that analyzer would conform to the generic type as well as this analyzer specific one. At that stage, yeah, the analyzer specific schemas would become more informational and wouldn't be tightly bound to, or may not be tightly bound to code in GitLab. Yeah, so it's there's benefits to doing this. It would make it easier to, or you would get the improvements of the view components reflected in the vulnerability dashboard for like a SAS or DAS report. Let's see. There's something else I was going to say, but I'm kind of blanking on it.
James, how many, should I be asking questions now, or have you got a ton more slides you want to go through?
No, it was more, so going through the story and kind of painting the broader picture, I was trying to keep it a bit more high level and not dive super deep into the code. So if you have questions, yeah, please go for it. I think, okay, let me just double check. Yeah, I just have a few summary slides going over things. Actually, let me cover those first, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions, and I can pull up code and yeah. All right, so I tried to cover some of the benefits that we would get from this. It helps us iterate and innovate faster. And so from the perspective of wanting to iterate faster on the vulnerability research team, this is one of the biggest wins in that area. So we would be able to implement a new analyzer type that doesn't conform to any of our existing schemas and start using it immediately without any back-end code changes, no front-end code changes, no database changes, and no schema changes. Once that proof of concept is something that we want to, I guess, make more official and let users know what type of data to expect in the report, then we could write a schema for it. But we wouldn't need the schema in order to have the analyzer. So to me, that's one of the bigger wins on this, at least from iterating. It also helps integrators. They have a lot more control over the content that shows up in the details field. And it makes the analyzer development accessible to anyone, basically. I mentioned that I created a tool. It's a very simple CLI Ruby tool that creates the report. But having that and a generic report type makes it so that anyone can write a new analyzer for their specific use case without needing to jump through all the hoops that a strongly typed analyzer currently has. And this is another benefit. It doesn't restrict us to the known scanner types. And I was actually racking my brain a lot trying to come up with useful examples that don't conform to our current security report types. And I did come up with some. And the time traveler one, that was something I came up with after I came up with 3 other ones. So I did add another, how do I get out of this? Here we go. So if we go back here, come on, click. All right, I need to go to a different job. So I did add 3 different security scanners or analyzers. I'm not sure if I would call the jobs analyzers, but I guess they are. They're producing a security report. I added 3 different ones. One to flag any Python files that it finds in the project. Another one to check all commits in that merge request to make sure they're signed, or make sure they have a valid GPG signature. And if they don't, it's a security vulnerability. And then the other one was, let's see, forbid Python. Oh, I guess time travel was my 3rd one. Yeah. But yeah, so these are, I could see these definitely being useful. The Python one is very straightforward and is something, this type of flexibility is something that I can see, especially security teams liking to use. I don't remember where I'm at on this.
Yeah, this would make it really easy and fast to create a purpose-built scanner. So if your organization's worried about a particular check or whatever, you could write a scanner very quickly and integrate it.
Yep. Here we go. this is test project. All right. So this is the signed commit checker, iterates for all the commits, and that's specifically set up just for merge requests. But this one is, I keep needing to resize these windows. All right, sorry about that. So this one specifically forbids Python. And all it does is find all the Python files and add a vulnerability for each of them. And that's it. I was trying to figure out ways to make this process even easier, but we still need that data. There's no way to get around it. But as far as that goes, this really isn't that bad. All right, so Cameron, I know you have questions and are waiting. I think I've covered most of it. So improvements to one view component will improve everyone that uses those view components, and it won't be tied to specific report rendering or renderer. Sets the stage for more advanced vulnerability tracking. And so I did want to point out a few things that it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that we can't still provide scanner-specific schemas, like we definitely can, and they don't even have to be the generic report type. But then you may not get the benefit from having those view components as those improve. And then this also doesn't mean that we can't have scanner-specific UI components that expect a certain schema. We definitely can still have that. We could have a SAS or DAST specific view of that report too. All right, so moving on to you, Cameron. What did you want to cover?
I mean, I don't have too much. I would say that one of the things I've struggled with this is there's pieces of this that I really like, and there's pieces of this that I'm not sure about yet. So as an example, I really like the concept of the details field and the fact that it's generic. I like how you've listed it out in the schema. I like the fact that it means the schema wouldn't change and then it's easy for integrators to add new fields. The concept of adding generic data does have limitations in terms of analytics, in terms of how you store it in the database, in terms of, how you're not sure what to show in the UI because you're not sure about the constraints of the data. But I mean, if people are happy with those limitations, then I think that's a sensible path to follow. I like the tracking field because at the moment it feels like, SAS to prefer to do tracking in Rails and DAST might prefer to do tracking on the actual scanner. And I think that provides a way for the scanner to actually decide where it should be done.
Yeah.
Or the analyzer, I should say. The thing I'm not sure about is if we implemented both of those things, that you could logically jump and say that we don't need specific schemas for DAST and SAST. And the reason I don't feel convinced of that yet is because there's just things that I don't know about. So, even on your presentation, then you went to the security dashboard and I'm like, oh yeah, but you can filter by SAST and DAST and all those other types. Like it's something I hadn't thought about, but is that something that's important?
So that's actually some of the changes that I mentioned that I hadn't gotten to. That is one of them where it, let's say I have my own scanner type, right? I'll just call it custom, right? Then like, should that even show up in the dropdown? Like we could just iterate through all the vulnerabilities in the report and grab whatever scanner name was declared and show that in the dropdown. We could do that. Right now it is closely tied to an enum in the database, right? And yeah, there's definitely pros and cons to both of them. And I've thought a lot about the database, being able to search through the data. So like, let's continue with the time traveler example. Say that it's an ongoing problem for future GitLab, and we want to be able to do past analytics on it, and we want to do things from a database perspective on those reports. You will definitely need to know where the fields are. So a schema for that would be required if you want to do that type of thing. And then it needs to be searchable, right? So Postgres has the JSON-B field. I'm pretty dang sure it's not as performant as just having its own database column, right? So you are still, let's see, if you don't want to pull individual fields out into their own columns, that does limit you, and you're 100% right on that. And the problem is that we don't know what we don't know. We don't know why we might want those fields in the future. And so if all that data is just in a JSON B field, then we'll be limited by, one, having a schema and knowing what those fields are, and then two, whatever performance and querying limitations JSON B fields have. Yeah, it is definitely a trade-off. Yeah,
On that though, like I'm not saying that's not the right trade-off to take, and particularly right now, because I would say that our secure solution is still fairly young and immature. So it's like if in 5 to 10 years when we've got 100 other fields, then maybe there's no point for a details field anymore because we've captured most of the space, or maybe there still is. But in terms of your in terms of the JSONB and the indexing, so JSONB does have an index, but I think the point is that you won't be able to index because you won't know the name of their field.
So,
they can name it whatever they want. You
Has
can index based on the type because we have defined types, right?
So I'm actually not sure that JSONB indexing needs to be on specific fields. I think it's more about being able to quickly find the right fields in the JSON. And so it indexes all the fields. I haven't used it directly. I've read the documentation for it twice, maybe 1.5 times. So if somebody else has more experience, I would love, yeah.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is we kind of have that problem today, right? Like we can go in and add fields for Dast, but they're not searchable necessarily on the dashboard until we do the work to get them searchable. So it's not a problem that we don't have today.
Well, we've got raw metadata, right? We're currently looking to break that out into its own tables and fields. So yeah, it's already something we're dealing with.
I think though the difference is that we can do it today if we want to. On details, if you've got three analyzers running, they all produce the code snippet, but they name the code snippet something different, you're not going to be able to search. You could search for code snippets, right? But you won't know whether that code snippet means the code where the problem was found, or it might mean a code snippet that might be a suggested solution. You just don't know the difference because of the flexibility we've given.
Yeah, and that's where I think if you were expecting the format to not change, that's where you would have to have version schemas, right? So that you know what to expect. Yeah, you were going to say something, Seth?
No, if that's the case, it's a generic field and you want to be able to search it. You have a new schema and you say, hey, this is now a typed field and it's no longer part of the generic. You can leave it in there and we'll handle it as a generic field. But if you want it searchable, you throw it up as a strongly typed field.
So
yes,
let's see. If you putting it above or out of the details field, that also implies like a one-to-one mapping in the database, right?
Right.
Is that
exactly.
what you're saying? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So if we decide and that's what we have with severity and a bunch of, I think there's like 7 fields. We just add a new one that says, hey, code snippet is now called code snippet and it's now searchable.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the question. Sorry, Tiago, you go.
No, it's all right. I was just interested in one of the questions, but I can wait.
Oh, that's right. There's more in the document. Let's see. We have, oh, cool. We've got, I guess,
5 minutes.
5 minutes before the meeting officially ends. All right. So let's see. So Cameron's, are these fields persisted to the database? So in the first merge request that I created to test out the dynamic fields, so not this proof of concept one, the first one, I added a separate raw details field that was JSONB. In this case, I just left it in the raw metadata field. I didn't see a reason to pull it out. And if we wanted it searchable, then I would say we should probably just change that to a JSONB field instead of leaving it as a text field. Yeah, so it is persisted just in the current raw metadata field in the database. Oh, okay. Being able to search vulnerabilities. I would lean heavily on JSONB indexing and searching like we just talked about. Yeah.
Although searching would be done by Elasticsearch, not by our database, I presume, right?
I'm not sure. Probably.
Although,
Yeah.
so my understanding is that you would probably have some kind of, so Elasticsearch defines a mapping, which is in JSON. There's no reason why you couldn't put the details kind of mapping directly into Elasticsearch, but I would have thought that would be fairly suboptimal because it has different fields. It would have the same indexing problem.
So you could.
But I'm not an expert of Elasticsearch.
You could collapse the JSON down and change all the field names to just be their path in the JSON document instead of an actually nested hierarchy. That might help a little bit. I don't know. I actually hadn't thought about that. So do we use, do we have any search capabilities right now on the vulnerability dashboard? I know we've got sorting.
No, that was something, we had a sort of a rough draft of a plan for that in the future. And at the time, the advisement was, we are not at a place where it would be probably prudent for us to proceed forward with that. They need to make some more changes and I think improvements to the search infrastructure GitLab wide.
Okay,
but
cool.
But it is something that we've looked into. We may get it actually sooner than that, potentially on the reverse side, and adding vulnerability results to some of the existing global search capabilities.
Nice. That would be cool. Okay. So yeah, Cameron, the Elasticsearch aspect of it, I hadn't connected that we would have to be doing it in there. So that's a very good point.
I think it would work for either solution though. And when I say either solution, I essentially mean like a generic details field where people can list their own thing versus we have to enumerate the entire state space of all the possible fields people might have.
Yeah.
You know, two extremes.
So an example of types of fields, actually, I might have this up. So a few jobs ago, I wrote a fuzzing framework, and it focused not so much on the tool itself, but more handling the automation of spinning up environments and capturing results and searching through it. And I use a MongoDB database for that, so it's all JSON basically. But I did expose just basically direct querying functionality, where if I knew the schema of the type of data coming out of the fuzzer, then I would be able to search for like find me all crashes where EAX is this, and it is this type of crash, and it is this. But it's not quite what we're going for here, and even as far as fuzzing goes, that's not quite the use case for it. But being able to dig down into that, if you know the schema, can be really powerful. It was one of my favorite features I had of that. Let's see. So, all right. So Seth said, I like that third parties can add fields without asking for changes to the schema. Yeah, that is what I was trying to demonstrate with the time traveler example, which was really fun, by the way. Yeah, it was. So you can expose a schema if you want to share it and let other people know what to expect, but you don't have to. And it really does. The concept of zero cost integrations, I think, is going to have a bigger impact than we're kind of thinking right now even. At least for me in the past, eliminating that degree of bottleneck, it's always been hard to tell how big of an impact it would have, where I've always kind of underestimated it. So I'm pretty excited about that.
I think the other potential use case is not necessarily security, but it could be as a very, very lightweight compliance mechanism. So I could write a script to make sure every single one of my repos has a license file, and the license file has X, Y, and Z. I could write that exactly the way you did, throw it as a security scanner, and then any repo that doesn't have the right license or doesn't have the right copyright notice or whatever it may be shows up on the security dashboard.
So actually, that was one of the examples that I was going to do, but I figured 3 was enough, was to just have a quick curl of the project itself. And if it was publicly available, then flag it as a security error. A lot of companies would absolutely freak out if they accidentally made a project public. Cool. glad you liked it, Tiago. Let's see. But yeah, are there any other questions? Do you want to see my local instance running? We could write a quick analyzer if you wanted to. I could give you control of my screen.
I have a self-interested question, because just before this, Seth and Matt and Lindsay and I were talking a little bit about that comment that Matt made on the Markdown idea.
Yeah.
Which is a subset of what you propose. This is a lot more powerful and solves a lot more of the problems that we have. And I'm kind of wondering, should I even bother? Like, it doesn't sound like this would be a whole lot more work than doing the Markdown thing, and this just sounds better.
So let's see. So if you wrap it up, I couldn't find an existing view component that just rendered Markdown from a JSON blob. Well, there was one, but I was iffy about using it. So if you either figured out how to do that and just went with what you're currently planning, we could reuse that with this, right? I don't see there being that much.
Yeah, the other proposal was essentially, in your example, we have 8 different, or I don't know what the number was, different view components.
Yeah.
The other architecture was actually, you actually just have one view component, it's Markdown, and that there's a templating engine that is responsible for taking the JSON, converting it into Markdown, and then the dashboard just renders Markdown. So it's just moving the work to a different tier.
And the Markdown, I think, is a little bit for convenience, right? You could use ERB or Hamo or any other templating engine. Is just about how much do you want to allow, or how much work is it to make that user vendor data secure? Otherwise, they could be writing JavaScript straight into our DOM. You don't want that, I think.
Yep.
I'm guessing.
So,
but yeah, I guess it's a question for Matt and Seth as well as you, James. Like, would we do that is it interesting to do that as a stepping stone towards this, to play with the idea of generic UIs or vendor controlled UIs? I don't know.
Well, it's working right now, and I don't think the code is too bad. So
You're biased.
View components don't. Yes, I am very biased. Although I will say I did copy a lot of our existing view components, so they shouldn't have fallen too far. They're just missing tests and probably some documentation. But yeah, I'd be willing to help make that work too. As far as having a generic Markdown component, I mentioned earlier that was something I was trying to get in for the demo as well, because then you could have inline code blocks and styling and stuff like that too.
Yeah, the Markdown, what you've done, I think it's already better than Markdown. It's not as generic, but I think the Markdown idea it sounded a lot simpler. But when you come with a POC that's working and it's a lot more structured, like, what's the point, right?
There's pros and cons to both, though, right? It's like nested lists and Markdown are a pain to write, but having it more structured and you define it in JSON, it's super easy. Yeah, so yeah, definitely pros and cons to both, and yeah, we could have both though.
Yeah, and it's also where you shift the work, right? So in this case, the work is on the threat insights or on the dashboard team. Whereas if you're just rendering out Markdown, then the work to figure out what that Markdown is on the analyzers teams. So it kind of depends on where we want that to sit. So like in what we saw today, if it doesn't support a certain kind of display, we're stuck until threat insights or who's ever managing that view stuff can build it.
Well, I don't think so. We were talking about this with Matt and Lindsay. We're all insecure, and if this is an approach that we all support and review and agree with, I don't see why Neil's team or Lindsay's team could do. You're not locked on threat insights.
Yeah, and I would say the view components, like the architecture, it's very easy to add another component, right? If we have a bulleted list or a numbered list or whatever, we can do that without too many conflicts. Like, that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
It's certainly much cleaner than going into the code today and just doing some if statements.
So I will say there is an important point that I didn't quite get to for the proof of concept. The typed fields definitely need to be versioned, as well as the view components, right? And so let's say we make breaking changes to the list component, right? We need to still be able to render those old reports. So that would definitely be a part of it. Yeah, I wanted to have it in the code for this, but I did have to stop and start making slides and everything.
I don't think you'd have to version them independently of the schema version, though. Just every time you changed it, you changed the schema version entirely.
Could you say that again?
Well, imagine you have some definition for a list in your details field, and then you want to change or add a new property to that details field. That would, in theory, be a new type or an extension of that type. So you would just re-release the schema version with a new number, right?
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Is that what you were saying?
I was thinking like trying to come up with a good example. Say we have a complex component. That's where I see more problems coming in, where it's rendering an HTTP request. And instead of having, say we change the way we have the headers fields from being an object to an array of objects, that would definitely be a breaking change. And the view components would have to know how to render the new version and the old one. That's kind of more what I was saying.
Yeah, and that's not different to the problem we have now, where GitLab, in theory, supports a whole range of different secure report versions. So yeah. I don't think that changes.
Okay, well, cool. Yeah, that makes Thanks, Cameron.
It's not worse than it already is. Yay.
My only request on this is if we're going to do the detail stuff and the tracking stuff and then potentially migrate the security reports into one, that we just do it separately, just from a risk perspective.
Yeah.
Not that, I mean, it would be huge to do it all together anyway. But
I would see this as a parallel running for a little while until we're comfortable and it's stable and we're confident that it does what, the unknowns that we talked about, until we're a bit more comfortable with that.
But Cameron, I think what you're talking about is there's the tracking that we saw introduced today, and then the details, which we saw introduced. I think, Cameron, what you're saying.
And then the extension on top of that, which is removing the DAS report, SAS report schema, and all the other specific schemas. I wouldn't, particularly the last part, I'd want to have those other two pieces in place first before we make a decision on the last part.
Right. Yep.
And I can explain a little bit more about that. So the reason why the proof of concept, so the proof of concept is more about adding the generic report type. It's the best way to kind of demonstrate everything. But in order to add the generic type, I needed the details field and I needed the tracking field. If we wanted to add a tracking field to our existing, say, SAS and DAS report types, 100%. That can be done entirely separately. But for a generic report type, that's a prerequisite to have it in, right? Same with the details field. So we can definitely do that separately.
Matt, what's the likelihood of this being prioritized?
My head is full. From what I've seen, I've been following the threads, and I think this solves quite a few current and future state problems. I guess I'd need to understand a little bit more exactly where the work is for us versus the scanner teams. It sounds like, if I heard that correctly, we could go down a path of implementing this, and then the scanner teams could sort of jump on as they're ready. It wouldn't have to be a one-shot deal, which I like. Yeah, I think, Thiago, you and Lindsay and I are just going to need to chat a little bit more, but I do have it right now, Cam, in my roadmap, that we spend at least a couple of iterations working on how we handle some of the data on the back end for presentation. And I think this would fit pretty closely with that.
And also, if you wouldn't mind, Matt, if you could invite Neil to those as well. I want, my concern is that the Threat Insights team has a lot more front end work than they could probably handle, and so I want to involve Neil, if you don't mind, to see if perhaps we can borrow people from our front end to assist.
Yeah, that would be fantastic, especially since once we get this done, it sounds like this is going to pay dividends in terms of saving us work down the line, which I very much like.
Yeah, completely. I'm definitely with you on that.
Oh, and
So Matt, I didn't kind of catch, what are you looking at in terms of timeline for this or the Markdown or one of those?
I think if I assume that this would fit with where I had it on current roadmap plan, I think it's 13.5. I was looking to start some of the more like code structural data changes for things in support of mostly the MR changes, the improvements there, but I think this kind of goes a little bit broader than that. I think I'd certainly want to see what the scope looks like overall, but I had budgeted at least 2 iterations dedicated to this from a back-end perspective, but this, I hadn't accounted for a front-end bleed over on this one.
So you're thinking if this started in 13.5, maybe 13.7, it's available kind of thing?
I mean, these are numbers on a,
yep.
on a line. I'll say this goes far beyond, I think, what I had conceived. It hits so many of the points. I don't really quite know where to fit this, but this is so important that I don't think we can't not start actioning towards something like this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason that's interesting to me is because we're adding fields right now for fuzzing and for JAS and all that. And so we're continuing to move forward on that, which we would instead move them to a generic format. So it's just trying to figure out which approach we take on those sides so that we can keep moving forward.
Yeah, it sounds like
I don't want to finish and then you get this great generic thing available and it's like, well, we're already done. We don't even need it.
Yeah, no, I think it's probably makes sense to have an offline conversation, make sure we have all the EMs for all the scanner teams involved, and if not necessarily 100% on board, then aligned with the direction that we're going to take. Because I really like this. I like it quite a bit. I think it does more than I thought it did, and it solves a lot of unknown questions that we had kind of deferred for the future. So barring any like major gotchas in this or huge pushback from another team, I'd like to figure out a way to proceed with this quickly.
If I may, Matt, we have that epic coming out about moving raw metadata to their own tables. It sort of overlaps with this, sort of not, but there's also the epic around data integrity of the whole question about vulnerabilities versus vulnerability findings. There are null fields there. There are fields that are copied across both tables. And I feel like if we're going to make something more generic and we need to support something more generic, I would love to fix these problems before we build on top of the current database model to avoid, I don't know if it's part of what Cameron was fearful of, but it's what I am. It's are we building on sand here, and are we gonna introduce even more weird corner cases that we didn't foresee if we don't tighten down the models?
So just from I guess a little bit broader perspective, the reason why I'm not super fearful of that is looking across other vendors that play in this kind of integrate anything, multiple scan types, right? They are trying to take in DAST, SAST, IAST, whatever. That's their whole business. They have very similar approaches and structures. So they've got their sort of first tier integrators, which we have, and then they've got generic formats, which to be honest are far less elegant than what you've got, James, but it's effectively tell us about the machine details and give us a name and an identifier, and then here's your big construct for whatever else you want to put in there. And it's just a generic key value pair, and they will render it to the screen. And there's at least 2 vendors that I've looked at their schemas. It's exactly what they do. So I think we're going to have a kind of a better version of that if we take this kind of approach. but I'm just the product manager. You guys tell me.
I'm pretty biased too. So I did want to say thank you all for coming to the Brown Bag. I know it's been a long ongoing conversation. And yeah, thanks for sticking with it.
Thanks for presenting it. And actually, it's nice to take what was in the issue and actually understand it a bit better.
Yeah, and things have evolved a bit more from that issue. It's really hard to have really large discussions and capture the current state of where things are. So I was happy to have this as a way to kind of encapsulate all of that too. Well, cool. I guess if that's it, then I'll stop the recording and yeah, we'll be done. Thank you all for attending.